There is a pain that rarely arrives like a storm. It does not always announce itself with tragedy, with dramatic endings, with obvious loss. Sometimes it enters quietly, through expectation, through clinging, through the silent hope that something or someone will remain exactly as you need them to remain, through the belief that if life would only stay arranged in a certain way, then finally you could relax. Then finally you could breathe. Then finally you could be at peace. But life does not stay arranged. People change, bodies change, moods change, plans change, success changes, love changes. The world shifts beneath everything we try to hold. And so many human beings live in a constant, low-grade heartbreak, not only because bad things happen, but because they are trying to build permanent peace on things that were never permanent. This is one of the deepest teachings Krishna gives in the Bhagavad Gita. And it is not a cold teaching. It is not meant to make you love less. It is not meant to make you indifferent. It is not meant to turn you into someone detached from beauty, intimacy, joy, ambition, or the tenderness of life. It is meant to show you why the heart suffers so deeply when it clings. Because attachment, in the way Krishna speaks of it, is not the same as love. Attachment is love mixed with fear, love mixed with possession, love mixed with demand, love mixed with the ego's desperate need for security. And when love becomes entangled with these things, suffering begins quietly, even before loss arrives. You can feel this in ordinary life. The moment you begin to depend on a certain response from someone in order to feel okay, the moment your peace becomes tied to a result you cannot control, the moment your identity becomes fused with a role, a relationship, a dream, an image of yourself, a version of the future, or a story about how life must unfold. At first, it feels natural, even beautiful. You care deeply. You want something wholeheartedly. You love someone sincerely. You work for a dream intensely. And none of that is wrong. But somewhere along the way, the mind begins to say something dangerous. This must stay. This must happen. This must not change. I cannot lose this. I cannot fail here. I cannot be okay without this. And from that moment on, suffering has already begun. Not because loss has happened yet, but because the heart has started building its home in something fragile. This is why the Bhagavad Gita remains so piercingly relevant, because Krishna is not only speaking to warriors on an ancient battlefield, he is speaking to every human being who has ever confused clinging with love, control with safety, and possession with peace. He is speaking to the person who cannot stop checking for a message, to the person whose mood rises and falls with recognition, to the person who built their worth on success, to the person terrified of losing love, to the person still carrying pain from something that ended years ago, to the person trying to hold together a version of life that is already changing. He is speaking to us, and he begins in the most human place possible, with Arjuna collapsing, not because he feels nothing, but because he feels too much. He sees before him teachers, relatives, loved ones, people tied to his identity, his memory, his sense of self. He sees a future in which what he loves may be destroyed. And in that moment, his body weakens, his bow slips, his mind is disturbed, his clarity disappears. He does not merely face external conflict. He faces attachment revealed. And Krishna, with extraordinary compassion and precision, begins to show him why attachment creates suffering. The first thing Krishna does is not shame Arjuna for caring. This matters deeply because many people misunderstand spiritual teaching and imagine that wisdom requires emotional numbness, as if the goal were to become distant, unfeeling, untouched by life. But Krishna does not ask Arjuna to become stone. He asks him to see clearly. And clear seeing begins with one of the most radical truths in the Gita. What is temporary cannot be the foundation of lasting peace. This is not pessimism. It is spiritual realism. Everything the senses touch is changing. Pleasure changes. Pain changes. Praise changes. Blame changes. Youth changes. Beauty changes. Health changes. Relationships change. Social roles change. Even the body itself changes from childhood to adulthood to old age, and one day it falls away. The mind changes too. Desires come and go. Opinions rise and dissolve. Emotions visit and depart. Even your sense of who you are has changed many times across your life. And yet, despite living inside a world of constant movement, the human being keeps trying to make changing things behave like eternal ones. This is the root of attachment. The refusal to let impermanent things be impermanent. The insistence that what is passing should stay. The demand that life obey the heart's fear. You see it in relationships. I love you, therefore you must remain exactly the same. You see it in ambition. I worked for this, therefore success must secure me forever. You see it in identity. I became this person, therefore I must never lose this image. You see it in spiritual life. I had one profound experience, therefore I must feel that way all the time. The mind turns every beautiful thing into a contract, and then suffers when reality refuses to sign it. Krishna's teaching cuts directly into this illusion. He reminds Arjuna that what is born will die, and what dies will be born again. That pleasure and pain arise from contact with the world and are temporary, that the wise endure them without becoming internally shattered. This does not mean the wise do not feel. It means they do not build their center on what cannot remain. This is the first great healing, to understand that suffering is not caused only by loss itself. It is intensified by the illusion that what changes should not have changed, by the thought this was not supposed to happen, by the protest this cannot be ending, by the demand this person, this role, this success, this stage of life must remain because I tied my sense of self to it. And once the self is tied to the changing, fear becomes inevitable, because what changes will keep changing. This is why attachment and fear are inseparable. The more tightly you cling, the more frightened you become. The more you make your peace dependent on one person, one outcome, one role, one identity, one future, the more fragile your inner life becomes. Because now your emotional stability is hostage to something outside your full control. This is why even before loss, attachment suffers. It suffers through anticipation, through anxiety, through jealousy, through control, through constant monitoring, through inner bargaining, through the terror of what might happen. Many people think suffering begins when they lose the thing. But often, suffering begins much earlier. It begins the moment the soul says, I need this in order to be whole. And Krishna's teaching is meant to free us from that bondage, not by making us reject life, but by showing us that nothing external can carry the burden of completing the self. To understand this more deeply, we have to look at how attachment forms. It rarely begins as something ugly. It often begins as simple contact, You encounter a person, an opportunity, a pleasure, an idea, a possibility. The mind turns toward it. It lingers there. It thinks about it repeatedly. It imagines a future with it. It gives it emotional weight. And Krishna describes this process with remarkable precision. He says that when a person dwells on the objects of the senses, attachment arises. From attachment comes desire. From desire comes anger when desire is obstructed. From anger comes delusion. From delusion comes loss of memory. From loss of memory comes the destruction of intelligence. And from that, the person falls. This is not just ancient philosophy. It is a map of psychological suffering. First, the mind dwells. That is where it starts. Not with dramatic collapse. With repeated attention, you think about the person again and again. The outcome, again and again. The pleasure, again and again. The image of success, again and again. The fear, again and again. What the mind repeatedly dwells upon becomes emotionally charged. And once emotionally charged, the object is no longer just part of life. It becomes loaded with identity, hope, security, fantasy, and need. Now, attachment has formed. And once attachment forms, desire intensifies. Not simple preference, dependence. Not, it would be nice. I must have this. I must keep this. I must not lose this. Then life does what life always does. It becomes uncertain. It delays. It changes. It moves in ways the ego did not approve. And the attached mind reacts. Anger appears, or panic, or despair, or jealousy, or obsession, or grief mixed with wounded pride. This is why attachment is so painful, because it is never just about the object. It is about the self, the mind, built around the object. Take away the object, and the attached mind feels not only loss, but personal collapse, because it had woven the thing into its identity. This is why some people do not merely lose a relationship. They lose their entire emotional center. Some do not merely lose a job. They lose the self-image that told them who they were. Some do not merely miss an opportunity. They feel as if life itself betrayed them. The suffering is magnified because attachment fused the object with the self. And Krishna is trying to prevent precisely this confusion. He teaches Arjuna again and again that the true self is deeper than the changing field of material life, deeper than roles, deeper than emotional waves, deeper than gain and loss, deeper than what is acquired and what is taken away. This is the heart of his freedom, because if you do not know what you truly are, you will try to complete yourself through what you can hold, and whatever you try to hold will eventually shake. That is why attachment creates suffering, not because care is wrong, but because the ego tries to secure eternity through temporary forms, and temporary forms cannot carry that weight. At this point, a very important question arises. If attachment causes suffering, then what is the alternative? Should we stop loving? Should we stop caring deeply? Should we stop wanting anything? Should we stop building, hoping, committing, and giving ourselves to life? Krishna's answer is far more beautiful than withdrawal. The alternative to attachment is not indifference. It is love without possession, action without bondage, care without clinging, commitment without psychological slavery, presence without the illusion of ownership. This distinction changes everything, because attachment often imitates love so convincingly that many people cannot tell the difference. Attachment says, I love you, therefore you must stay. Love says, I honor your soul, even while knowing I do not own it. Attachment says, this success must define me. Love says, I will give myself sincerely to the work, but I will not reduce my being to the result. Attachment says, if this changes, I will be destroyed. Love says, change may hurt deeply, but my deepest self is not destroyed by change. Attachment clings because it is afraid. Love can hold and release. Attachment turns the other into a source of self-completion. Love meets the other as sacred, not as property. Attachment demands permanence from impermanent things. Love receives beauty without demanding that beauty obey fear. This is why Krishna's teaching is not anti-love. It is anti-bondage. It is against the kind of inner dependence that turns life into constant anxiety. The attached mind cannot enjoy fully because it is always afraid of loss. It cannot relax into love because it is secretly trying to secure itself through the beloved. It cannot work peacefully because it has made the work carry the burden of identity. It cannot receive praise lightly because it has become hungry for confirmation. It cannot endure criticism because the ego is overinvested in image. Everything becomes too heavy. Everything becomes loaded. Everything becomes dangerous because the mind is asking finite things to hold infinite emotional weight. And then it wonders why the heart feels tired. Love, in Krishna's teaching, becomes pure when it is no longer built on delusion. When it no longer says, this person is mine in an ultimate sense. This outcome is mine in an ultimate sense. This body is mine forever. This role is mine forever. This stage of life is mine forever. The moment you believe that, fear enters, because deep down, the soul knows nothing here can be owned permanently. The ego may pretend otherwise, but reality keeps reminding us through endings, through aging, through uncertainty, through the mysterious movement of life. Krishna does not offer security through control. He offers freedom through wisdom. He says, in essence, love what is here, serve what is true, do your duty, act with sincerity, but do not chain your soul to what cannot remain. This is not less intimate. It is more real, because once attachment softens, love becomes less anxious. Work becomes less toxic. Relationship becomes less possessive. Ambition becomes less desperate. Even grief becomes cleaner. Not smaller, cleaner, because it is no longer mixed with the illusion that the changing should have remained unchanged forever. One of the reasons attachment creates such deep suffering is that it distorts perception. Once the mind becomes attached, it stops seeing clearly. It sees through fear, craving, and projection. This is why people in attachment often do not relate to reality as it is. They relate to reality as the ego needs it to be. They do not only see the person, they see what the person must provide emotionally. They do not only see the opportunity, they see what it must prove about them. They do not only see the future, they see what it must become in order for them to feel safe. This is incredibly common. A person becomes attached to being admired, and suddenly every neutral interaction feels like judgment. A person becomes attached to a relationship, and suddenly every silence feels like threat. A person becomes attached to success, and suddenly every setback feels like humiliation. A person becomes attached to being right, and suddenly every disagreement feels like an attack on identity. The attached mind does not rest in truth. It bends truth around fear. This is why Krishna links attachment to delusion. Because attachment is not merely emotional intensity, it is distortion. It tells you, this must not change. It tells you, I cannot survive this. It tells you, I know what must happen. It tells you, My happiness depends entirely on this form remaining available to me. And then reality, as reality always does, begins to move. The person changes. The outcome delays. The body ages. The world shifts. And because the attached mind had already built a fantasy of permanence, the natural movement of life now feels like violence. This is why some suffering feels larger than the event itself. It is not only the event, it is the collapse of illusion. What you were holding was never fully holdable. What you were trying to freeze was never still. And what you were asking to complete you was never designed for that purpose. This is painful to realize. But it is liberating too, because if suffering is intensified by illusion, then wisdom can reduce suffering by restoring clear vision. Krishna keeps bringing Arjuna back to what is real. The self is not the body alone. The world of forms is changing. Pleasure and pain are temporary. Action must be done, but the fruits cannot be owned absolutely. The wise remain steady because they do not mistake passing experience for the eternal ground of being. This steadiness is not emotional coldness. It is clarity protected from delusion. And for modern people, this is essential, because so much of contemporary suffering is intensified by false narratives of control. We are taught that with enough effort, enough strategy, enough self-improvement, enough emotional management, enough productivity, enough desirability, enough optimization, we should be able to secure life against uncertainty. But Krishna would say this is still attachment in a refined form. The ego trying to gain peace through perfect control of changing conditions. And it will fail, because life is not a machine built to satisfy the anxious mind. It is sacred, mysterious, shifting, relational, and beyond possession. To love life wisely, you must stop trying to imprison it. This is where surrender enters. Not as defeat, as relief. Attachment says, I must hold everything together. Surrender says, I was never meant to carry the whole universe on the shoulders of my ego. Attachment says, I must control the future in order to be okay. Surrender says, I will act sincerely, but I release the arrogance of pretending everything belongs to my control. Attachment says, if this leaves me, I am nothing. Surrender says, loss may wound me, but my deepest being is not annihilated by change. This is one of the greatest medicines in the Gita, because attachment exhausts the nervous system. It creates constant vigilance, constant checking, constant emotional bargaining, constant fear of the next change, constant internal grasping. And the body feels this, the mind feels this, the heart feels this. Even joy becomes tense when attachment is present. You receive something beautiful, and part of you cannot simply enjoy it. Part of you is already worried about keeping it. This is the tragedy of attachment. It steals peace not only after loss, but during possession. The attached mind cannot fully rest even when it has the thing, because now it has something to defend, something to monitor, something to fear losing. This is why attachment does not actually solve insecurity. It spreads insecurity across time. Before getting the thing, it says, I need this to be okay. After getting the thing, it says, now do not lose it. The prison remains. Only the scenery changes. Krishna offers freedom by shifting the center of the self. If you know yourself only as the grasping mind, then of course attachment feels natural. The grasping mind survives by collecting and defending. But if you begin to know yourself as the witnessing consciousness, the Atman, something changes. You still participate in life. You still love. You still grieve. You still hope. You still act. But you no longer take every movement of life as a total definition of who you are. You stop demanding. ultimate security from temporary things. You stop asking people to save you from the incompleteness of ego. You stop turning outcomes into altars. And then a new kind of peace becomes possible. Not the peace of controlling everything. The peace of no longer needing everything to stay the same in order to remain inwardly grounded. This is mature spirituality. Not escaping relationship, work, and beauty, but entering them with less possession, less illusion, less fear, more reverence, more freedom, more truth. This is why Krishna can teach detachment without teaching coldness. Because true detachment is not emotional absence. It is freedom from compulsive clinging. It is the ability to let life move without losing the soul. It is the ability to love what is here while knowing it is not yours in an absolute sense. It is the ability to give your full heart without demanding that impermanent forms become eternal guarantees. This is incredibly subtle and incredibly healing because many people do not need to love less. They need to cling less. They do not need to stop caring. They need to stop turning care into inner captivity. They do not need to stop engaging with life. They need to stop making life obey the ego's fear. There is also a quieter reason attachment creates suffering. It prevents us from seeing the sacredness of the present moment. When the mind is attached, it is rarely fully here. It is leaning forward into fear or backward into memory. It is asking, how do I keep this? How do I get more of this? How do I make sure this never changes? How do I recover what is gone? How do I avoid what might happen? The attached mind is not really in relationship with life. It is negotiating with life. It is trying to secure itself against impermanence. And because of that, it misses the living depth of what is actually here. This is one reason attachment can exist even in beautiful moments. A person can be with someone they love and still not be fully present because part of the mind is already afraid of losing them. A person can achieve something meaningful and still not feel joy because part of the mind is already chasing the next fruit. A person can be in prayer and still not be surrendered because part of the mind is still bargaining with God. Attachment cannot receive deeply because it is too busy trying to secure. Krishna's wisdom opens another possibility: to live in the present as offering, to love in the present as offering, to act in the present as offering, to receive beauty in the present without immediately converting beauty into fear. This is a profound inner shift. The flower blooms, and instead of saying, "This must remain forever," you allow yourself to receive its beauty fully in the moment. A relationship is alive, and instead of trying to possess the soul of the other, you meet them with gratitude, truth, and reverence. A season of life is here, and instead of building your entire identity on it, you honor it while it lasts. A success arrives, and instead of turning it into proof of worth, you offer thanks and continue. Even grief becomes different under this wisdom, because when something passes, you can mourn what was beautiful without insisting that the passing should never have happened. This does not make grief small. It makes grief honest. Attachment says, this ending should not be real. Wisdom says, this ending is painful, but it belongs to the nature of the world of forms. Attachment says, I am ruined because this changed. Wisdom says, I am wounded, but I am deeper than this change. Attachment says, if I lose this, I lose myself. Krishna says, you have mistaken the changing for the self. This is why the Gita is so compassionate. It does not merely tell us to stop suffering. It reveals the mechanism by which suffering deepens. Then it points beyond it, not toward emotional deadness, toward spiritual steadiness, toward the kind of heart that can remain open without becoming enslaved, toward the kind of love that does not devour what it loves, toward the kind of action that does not collapse when fruit changes, toward the kind of life that can participate fully in the world while remembering that the world is not the ultimate ground of being. That remembrance is everything, because the attached mind forgets. It forgets impermanence. It forgets the true self. It forgets the divine. It forgets that no human being, no achievement, no role, no possession can safely carry the burden of being your ultimate refuge. And once the mind forgets this, it starts worshipping forms. Then forms begin to rule its peace. That is bondage. And Krishna came to free Arjuna from that bondage, and through the Gita to free us too. Maybe this is why attachment hurts so much. Not only because it fears loss, but because it misplaces devotion. The heart was made to rest in something deeper than changing forms. To love changing forms? Yes. To honor them? Yes. To serve within them? Yes. But not to worship them as if they were ultimate. When the heart turns a person, an outcome, a success, a pleasure, or an identity into its final refuge, suffering becomes inevitable, because the finite cannot bear the weight of the infinite longing inside the soul. Only the divine can receive that longing without collapsing under it. This is why bhakti, devotion to Krishna, transforms attachment. It redirects the deepest hunger of the heart toward what is eternal. Then worldly life can be loved more cleanly. You no longer ask a relationship to be God. You no longer ask work to be salvation. You no longer ask success to grant ultimate worth. You no longer ask pleasure to erase existential emptiness. You no longer ask control to make you immortal. Instead, you let worldly life become participation, service, affection, beauty, responsibility, and love held within a deeper devotion. This is freedom, not because pain disappears, but because pain is no longer intensified by idolatry. If you give ultimate weight only to temporary things, every change becomes spiritual catastrophe. If the heart learns to rest in Krishna, then even painful changes do not sever you from the deepest center. This is the hidden compassion inside detachment. Detachment is not deprivation. It is protection from false worship. Protection from building your altar where everything is shaking. Protection from making your peace depend entirely on what time will eventually move. And when this begins to sink in, life changes. You still love, but with more honesty. You still work, but with less desperation. You still dream, but with less fear. You still commit, but with less possession. You still grieve, but with more space. You still feel deeply, but you are no longer drowned every time something changes form. That is spiritual maturity, not the disappearance of tenderness, the purification of tenderness. Before we go further, I want to ask you something quietly. Where in your life has attachment been creating suffering lately? A relationship? A result? An image of yourself? A future you keep trying to control? A fear of losing something precious? If this is speaking to you, write it in the comments in one word if you want. Or simply write the city you are listening from. Sometimes naming what the heart is holding is the beginning of loosening the grip, because the grip usually tightens in silence, and healing often begins in truth. So why does attachment create suffering? Because it asks changing things to behave like eternal ones. Because it turns love into fear. Because it fuses the self with what can be lost. Because it distorts perception. Because it builds hidden contracts with life. Because it mistakes possession for intimacy. Because it makes peace dependent on what cannot be controlled. Because it forgets the true self. Because it forgets God. And yet within this difficult truth there is immense hope. If suffering is intensified by attachment, then peace becomes possible as attachment loosens. Not because life stops changing, but because the heart stops demanding that change never come. Not because love disappears, but because love becomes cleaner. Not because ambition dies, but because action becomes less desperate. Not because grief is erased, but because grief is no longer compounded by illusion. This is the freedom Krishna offers. The freedom to live fully in the world, but not be inwardly chained to the changing world. The freedom to love without trying to own. The freedom to serve without making the fruit your master. The freedom to feel deeply without drowning in every wave. The freedom to let life move while the soul remains rooted in something deeper than movement. That freedom is not abstract. It begins in ordinary moments. When you notice the urge to control and breathe before obeying it. When you love someone and silently remember they are a soul, not your possession. When you work hard and release the hidden demand that success must define you. When you feel fear of loss, and instead of tightening, you bring the fear into awareness and prayer. When you enjoy what is beautiful without converting beauty into panic. When you grieve honestly without saying life has betrayed you simply because life has changed. These small moments matter. They are the training ground of freedom. They are where the Gita becomes lived instead of admired. They are where attachment slowly loosens and devotion deepens. And over time, something remarkable happens. The heart becomes lighter, not because it has stopped loving, but because it is no longer trying to imprison what it loves. The mind becomes steadier, not because uncertainty vanished, but because it is no longer demanding certainty from every corner of life. Action becomes cleaner, not because results stopped mattering, but because the soul stopped making results into its identity. This is the path Krishna offers Arjuna in the midst of crisis. And it is the path offered to us, not to withdraw from life, but to stand in life more truthfully, to let impermanent things be impermanent, to let love be love rather than fear, to let devotion return to its rightful center, to stop asking the world to do what only the divine can do. If this message spoke to something real in you, subscribe to the channel and leave a like so more people can discover these teachings from Krishna and the Bhagavad Gita. There are many ways the mind creates suffering, but there are also timeless ways to become free. And one of the deepest is this: hold gently, love deeply, offer sincerely, release repeatedly, and remember that what is truly you was never meant to be built out of what can be taken away. So why does attachment create suffering? Because it asks changing things to behave like eternal ones. Because it turns love into fear. Because it fuses the self with what can be lost. Because it distorts perception. Because it builds hidden contracts with life. Because it mistakes possession for intimacy. Because it makes peace dependent on what cannot be controlled. Because it forgets the true self. Because it forgets God. And yet within this difficult truth there is immense hope. If suffering is intensified by attachment, then peace becomes possible as attachment loosens. Not because life stops changing, but because the heart stops demanding that change never come. Not because love disappears, but because love becomes cleaner. Not because ambition dies, but because action becomes less desperate. not because grief is erased, but because grief is no longer compounded by illusion. This is the freedom Krishna offers. The freedom to live fully in the world, but not be inwardly chained to the changing world. The freedom to love without trying to own. The freedom to serve without making the fruit your master. The freedom to feel deeply without drowning in every wave. The freedom to let life move while the soul remains rooted in something deeper than movement. That freedom is not abstract. It begins in ordinary moments, when you notice the urge to control and breathe before obeying it, when you love someone and silently remember they are a soul, not your possession, when you work hard and release the hidden demand that success must define you, when you feel fear of loss and instead of tightening, you bring the fear into awareness and prayer, when you enjoy what is beautiful without converting beauty into panic, when you grieve honestly without saying life has betrayed you simply because life has changed. These small moments matter. They are the training ground of freedom. They are where the Gita becomes lived instead of admired. They are where attachment slowly loosens and devotion deepens. And over time, something remarkable happens. The heart becomes lighter, not because it has stopped loving, but because it is no longer trying to imprison what it loves. The mind becomes steadier, not because uncertainty vanished, but because it is no longer demanding certainty from every corner of life. Action becomes cleaner, not because results stopped mattering, but because the soul stopped making results into its identity. This is the path Krishna offers Arjuna in the midst of crisis. And it is the path offered to us, not to withdraw from life, but to stand in life more truthfully, to let impermanent things be impermanent, to let love be love rather than fear, to let devotion return to its rightful center, to stop asking the world to do what only the divine can do. If this message spoke to something real in you, subscribe to the channel and leave a like so more people can discover these teachings from Krishna and the Bhagavad Gita. There are many ways the mind creates suffering, but there are also timeless ways to become free. And one of the deepest is this: hold gently, love deeply, offer sincerely, release repeatedly, and remember that what is truly you was never meant to be built out of what can be taken away.